We've spent the last 2 years watching AI become a tool that billions of people use. What comes next is different in a way that most coverage hasn't caught up to yet. Agentic AI that sets its own subgoals, executes multi-step tasks autonomously, and operates across systems without per-step human oversight, is already in enterprise deployment. The data on what that means for the decade ahead is specific, contested, and almost entirely absent from the headlines. That's what this video is for. This is not a hype video. No product pitches. No founder quotes taken as evidence. Every claim comes from published institutional research, verified deployment data, or peer-reviewed economic modeling. And where the data is genuinely uncertain, which it is in several places that matter enormously, we will say so directly. But here is where we need to start. Because most people are carrying a definition of agentic AI that is either too narrow or too broad to be analytically useful. So what actually is agentic AI? Not the marketing version, the operational one. Agentic AI refers to systems capable of pursuing multi-step goals autonomously, breaking a complex objective into component tasks, sequencing those tasks, executing them across multiple tools and systems, monitoring outcomes, and adjusting approach based on results. Without waiting for human instruction at each step. The human sets the goal. The agent determines and executes the path. That distinction from tool to agent sounds like an incremental technical upgrade. It is not. It is the difference between a calculator and an employee. Hold that distinction for a moment, because it is the one that changes what every number in this video actually means. Everything that follows, the labor data, the economic projections, the risk picture, the governance gap, reads differently depending on whether you are thinking about AI as a tool or AI as an actor. Make sure you are holding the right frame before the evidence begins. And every economic model, every risk framework, every governance structure built around AI as a tool was built around the wrong entity. Now let's make that concrete. Picture someone we'll call Sarah, legal operations manager. 8 years of experience, highly regarded in her organization. Her days are built around managing document review workflows, coordinating discovery processes, overseeing contract analysis pipelines, routing outputs to the right legal teams, ensuring compliance with procedural requirements. Cognitively demanding work, process-intensive work, work that requires genuine domain knowledge and careful judgment about sequencing and prioritization. Sarah is not worried about AI, because Sarah manages complex legal workflows. That is skilled professional work. The kind of work that requires a trained human mind to orchestrate. And according to the agentic AI research we are about to examine, Sarah is precisely the professional profile this data is describing. Not because her work is simple, because her work is structured. Because the value her role delivers is primarily in the execution and coordination of defined processes within a well-documented domain. And that structured workflow execution within a defined domain is exactly what current agentic systems are being deployed to do. Sarah isn't a hypothetical. There are hundreds of thousands of professionals in roles built around the same architecture as hers, in legal departments, in financial planning teams, in software delivery organizations, who have built careers on the assumption that cognitive complexity equals job security. The agentic model is now asking that assumption to prove itself against a different test than it was built for. That is what the rest of this video is built to examine. Now here is why that matters immediately. In 2025, OpenAI launched operator-level agent products capable of executing complex workflows across third-party systems. Google DeepMind accelerated its Gemini agent architecture toward enterprise deployment. Cisco announced agentic AI integration across its networking and security infrastructure. Infrastructure that sits inside the operational backbone of thousands of major organizations globally. These are not research announcements. They are deployment announcements. Agentic AI is not coming. For significant portions of enterprise infrastructure, it is already there. And the institutional research on what happens next has not kept pace with the deployment reality. Here is the specific gap that shapes everything else in this video. The forecasts most analysts are citing McKinsey's labor displacement modeling, Goldman Sachs's GDP projections, the WEF's future of jobs estimates, were built on a model of AI as a tool that augments or replaces specific human tasks within defined workflows. That is a reactive AI model. A human initiates, AI assists or executes, human reviews, cycle repeats. Agentic AI breaks that model entirely. When an AI system can autonomously initiate, sequence, execute, and monitor multi-step workflows across systems, the unit of analysis is no longer the task. It is the role, potentially the team, and the economic models built around task-level automation produce fundamentally different outputs than models built around role-level or team-level autonomous execution. Most of the forecasts the public is currently relying on have not been rebuilt for the agentic paradigm yet. That is not a minor caveat. That is the central analytical problem with almost every AI economic forecast currently in circulation. So what does the data that has been rebuilt for the agentic paradigm actually say? That is exactly where we are going. And the answer, across labor markets, economic output, systemic risk, and governance, is more specific, more contested, and more consequential than the headline numbers suggest. Let's start with labor, because this is where the agentic shift produces its most immediate and most misunderstood consequences. The existing forecasts, McKinsey's 400 to 800 million occupational transitions by 2030, the WEF's net loss of 14 million roles by 2027, the OECD's 27% high-risk automation figure, were all built around a specific assumption about how AI interacts with work. That assumption is that AI replaces or augments discrete tasks within a role while the role itself remains structurally intact. A financial analyst still exists. AI handles some of the modeling. The analyst handles the judgment. That is the task substitution model. And it is the model almost every major labor forecast is built on. Agentic AI does not operate inside that model. Here is what makes that distinction concrete. In early 2025, several major financial institutions began piloting agentic AI systems capable of autonomously executing end-to-end research workflows, pulling data from multiple sources, running quantitative models, generating draft reports, flagging anomalies, and routing outputs to relevant decision-makers, without a human in the loop at each step. The human sets the research objective. The agent executes the entire workflow. The human reviews the output. Now think about what that does to the task substitution model. It doesn't substitute tasks within the analyst role. It substitutes the workflow the role was built around. The tasks still exist: data retrieval, modeling, report generation, anomaly detection. But they are now sequenced and executed by the agent. What remains for the human is goal setting, output evaluation, and judgment on edge cases the agent flags. That is a fundamentally different job description. And it is a job description that requires significantly fewer people to cover the same volume of work. This is not a projection. It is a documented deployment pattern already visible in financial services, legal research, software development, and customer operations as of 2025. So what does the data say about scale? Accenture's 2024 Technology Vision Report on Agentic AI in Enterprise Contexts estimated that agentic systems could automate between 40% and 75% of the workflow steps currently performed by knowledge workers. Not tasks within workflows, but workflow steps themselves. That range is wide for the same reason McKinsey's range is wide. Adoption pace, infrastructure readiness, and regulatory environment all shift the outcome significantly. But the floor of that range, 40% of workflow steps, is already within the capability envelope of systems currently in deployment. Let that land for a second. 40% of the workflow steps that define what a knowledge worker does on a given day, already automatable by systems that exist right now. Not in a lab. In production environments inside major enterprises in the USA and UK. And the ceiling of that range, 75%, describes a scenario where the role itself becomes primarily supervisory, where the human's primary function is not execution but oversight of an agent doing the execution. That is a different category of labor market disruption than task substitution. And the existing forecasts are not modeling it correctly. But here is where it gets more complicated, and where the data stops being straightforward. The disruption is not uniform, and the pattern of which roles face the highest agentic exposure is not identical to the pattern of task-level automation risk. Some roles that scored as relatively low risk under task substitution models score significantly higher under agentic workflow models. And some roles that appeared highly exposed under task models appear more resilient under agentic models, because what they actually require is the kind of contextual judgment, relationship management, and real-time adaptive decision-making that current agentic systems handle poorly outside of well-defined domains. The research on this distinction is still early, but it is directionally consistent. Goldman Sachs's 2024 analysis, Gen AI, Too Much Spend, Too Little Benefit, and its subsequent agentic-specific follow-on research identified that roles involving complex coordination across ambiguous, high-stakes environments remain substantially more resilient than the task substitution model predicted. Conversely, roles that appeared protected because they involved high cognitive load but within structured, well-defined workflows are more exposed under the agentic model than the earlier research suggested. That is a description of what Sarah does. Think about what that means for the professionals watching this. The question is no longer just, does my role involve tasks AI can replicate? The question is my role built around executing structured workflows within a defined domain? Because if it is, the agentic model puts it in a different risk category than the existing forecasts suggest. Here are 2 questions worth asking yourself right now. First, is the majority of my daily work executing defined processes within a structured, well-documented domain? Second, does my role's value come primarily from the execution of those processes, or from the judgment I apply at the decision points within them? If the answer to the first question is yes and the answer to the second is execution, the agentic model puts that role in the higher exposure category. If the answer to the second question is judgment, the role has substantially more resilience than both the task substitution models and the agentic models suggest. That distinction is the most practically useful thing this video can give you, and most people have not yet applied it to their own situation. If your role looks anything like Sarah's, those 2 questions matter more than any headline number you have read about AI this year. That recalibration is not a reason for panic. It is a reason for precision. The data is not telling you agentic AI eliminates knowledge work. It is telling you that the structural relationship between knowledge workers and the workflows they execute is being renegotiated faster and at a different level of the organizational stack than the task substitution forecasts anticipated. And the institutions that have begun modeling this shift specifically are producing numbers that diverge significantly from the consensus forecasts that most public coverage is still citing. That divergence is exactly where the most important analytical work is happening right now, and it connects directly to the economic output projections, where the numbers attached to agentic AI specifically are larger, more contested, and more dependent on assumptions most analysts aren't surfacing than anything we covered in the labor section. Now let's talk about the economic output projections, because this is where the agentic AI numbers diverge most sharply from the consensus forecasts, and where the assumptions buried inside the projections matter most. The baseline figure most analysts are still citing is PwC's $15.7 trillion AI contribution to global GDP by 2030. That number was produced in 2017. It was built on a model of AI as a productivity amplifier, something that makes existing workers and processes more efficient. It was not built on a model of AI as an autonomous economic actor capable of executing entire value chains without human labor input at each step. When you rebuild the model for the agentic paradigm, the numbers change significantly. McKinsey's 2023 report, The Economic Potential of Generative AI, estimated that generative AI could add between $2.6 trillion and $4.4 trillion in annual economic value globally across 63 enterprise use cases. That figure already represented a 15 to 40% increase over McKinsey's previous AI productivity estimates. Not an addition on top of them, but a revised and significantly higher projection replacing them. Agentic AI, as the architectural evolution that makes those use cases executable at workflow scale rather than task scale, is the mechanism through which that value potential gets realized at speed. The figure is generative AI broadly. The deployment vehicle increasingly being used to capture it is agentic. That last point is the one most economic coverage is not pricing incorrectly. Traditional productivity gains from technology follow a broadly linear pattern. Better tools make workers more productive, output increases proportionally. Agentic AI introduces a different dynamic. When a single agent can execute workflows that previously required a team, the relationship between labor input and economic output changes structurally, not incrementally. Here is what that looks like in practice. A customer operations analysis team that previously required 6 analysts to process a defined volume of weekly reporting workflows is now running the same volume with 1 analyst overseeing an agentic system. The workflow still happens. The reports still get produced. The anomalies still get flagged. The headcount is 1. Multiply that dynamic across every legal discovery department, every financial modeling team, every customer operations function in every knowledge work sector globally, and you are looking at the mechanism through which McKinsey's $2.60 to $4.40 trillion value estimate gets realized at the agentic deployment layer. Not productivity improvement. Structural labor substitution at the workflow level, generating returns that were previously dependent on proportional headcount. And the economic models built on incremental productivity assumptions produce fundamentally different GDP projections than models that account for that dynamic. But here is where the data gets uncomfortable in a specific way. The same nonlinear output dynamic that makes agentic AI economically attractive to enterprises is precisely what makes its labor market consequences more severe than the consensus forecasts suggest. If a single agentic system can do the work of a team, the productivity gain and the displacement event are the same event. Viewed from the enterprise's balance sheet, efficiency gain. Viewed from the labor market, structural reduction in knowledge worker demand that the task substitution models were not calibrated to capture. The IMF flagged this dynamic explicitly in its 2024 research. Their modeling suggests that agentic AI deployment at scale could accelerate the capital versus labor income split identified in their earlier AI analysis, because agentic systems are capital assets that generate returns at a scale and speed that previous automation technologies did not approach. The gains concentrate faster. The distribution challenge compounds. And the speed is the variable nobody is modeling cleanly. Previous general-purpose technology transitions, electrification, computing, the internet, gave labor markets decades to absorb structural changes. The agentic AI transition is operating on a different timeline entirely. Enterprise deployment is not waiting for regulatory frameworks, retraining infrastructure, or labor market adjustment mechanisms to catch up. That is not a rhetorical point. It is the most underweight variable in every major agentic AI economic forecast currently available. The gap between how fast agentic systems are being deployed and how fast the institutions built to manage that deployment are moving is where the most consequential near-term risks lie. And it connects directly to the risk picture. Because the same architectural features that make agentic AI economically powerful introduce a category of systemic risk that has no direct precedent in the history of technology deployment. Here is what that risk actually looks like in practice. Reactive AI fails predictably. A language model produces a bad output. A human reviews it. The error is caught at the review stage before it propagates. The failure mode is visible and containable because the human is in the loop at every execution step. Agentic AI fails differently. When an autonomous system is executing a multi-step workflow across multiple connected systems without per-step human oversight, an error in step 3 does not get caught at step 3. It gets built upon. The system continues executing steps 4, 5, 6, each one compounding the original error, before any human sees an output that triggers a review. By that point, the error has propagated through multiple systems, potentially triggered downstream actions in connected infrastructure, and created a failure state that is significantly harder to reverse than a single bad output from a reactive system. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a documented failure pattern. In 2024, multiple enterprise pilots of agentic systems in financial services and logistics reported sequences of compounding autonomous decisions that produced significant operational disruption. Outcomes no single decision in the sequence would have flagged as problematic, but which collectively created failure states that were difficult and costly to reverse. The individual steps were each within normal parameters. The sequence was not. Published safety research from Stanford HAI and DeepMind's alignment team has documented this failure mode specifically, technically described as specification gaming or objective misalignment under compounding execution, and identified it as one of the most actively researched open problems in agentic AI safety. And it is one that existing enterprise risk frameworks, regulatory structures, and liability models were not designed to handle. Which brings us directly to governance, and to the gap that every serious institutional researcher examining agentic AI identifies as the most urgent and least addressed problem in the entire landscape. The EU AI Act, the most comprehensive binding AI regulation currently in force anywhere in the world, was designed primarily around reactive AI systems. Its risk classification framework, its conformity assessment requirements, its transparency obligations, all of them assume a human is directing the AI system's actions at a meaningful level of granularity. Agentic systems, by definition, operate below that level of human direction, which means the most advanced AI governance framework in existence is structurally mismatched to the AI technology currently entering enterprise deployment at the fastest pace. That mismatch is not a gap that can be patched with a regulatory amendment. Consider what that mismatch looks like inside a real organization right now. A hospital system deploying an agentic AI to autonomously manage patient triage routing across departments. The EU AI Act classifies this as a high-risk AI system, which it is, and requires human oversight at a meaningful level of granularity for every consequential decision the system makes. The agentic system, by architectural definition, operates without that oversight at the step level. That is the entire point of deploying it. The hospital's compliance team trying to certify this deployment under the EU AI Act has no conformity pathway, because the Act's requirements assume a human is directing each consequential decision, and the system's clinical and operational value comes precisely from not requiring that direction at each step. That is not one hospital's compliance problem. It is the operational reality of every organization deploying agentic systems into regulated environments right now, before the governance framework has a category for what they are deploying. It requires a fundamental reconceptualization of what AI governance means when the entity being governed is not a tool responding to human instruction but an agent pursuing human-specified goals through autonomously determined means. And that reconceptualization at the institutional level across the EU, the US, the UK, and the international standards bodies attempting to coordinate global frameworks, has not yet produced binding regulatory output that matches the deployment reality on the ground. The window between where agentic AI deployment currently sits and where governance frameworks need to be is the most consequential policy gap in technology right now. And it is narrowing faster than the institutions responsible for closing it are moving. That is not an opinion. It is the consistent finding of the OECD's AI governance research, the UK AI Safety Institute's published assessments, and the EU AI Office's own internal gap analyses released in 2024. The institutions tasked with governing agentic AI are not currently equipped to govern it. That finding, and what it means for everything that follows, is exactly where we're finishing. So let's bring everything together. And let's start with the most important signal in this entire landscape, one that most coverage has not yet found a way to frame correctly. The institutions that got the first wave of AI analysis broadly right, McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, the WEF, the IMF, the OECD, are now producing research that explicitly flags the inadequacy of their own earlier models when applied to the agentic paradigm. That self-correction from the institutions themselves is not a footnote. It is the headline. When the organizations that built the forecasts everyone is citing start publishing research that says those forecasts were built on the wrong model. That is not a minor methodological update. It is a fundamental signal about where we actually are in this transition. Here is what those institutions are now telling you about their own earlier work. On labor, the task substitution model that produced the 400 to 800 million transition figure and the 27% high-risk automation estimate was built around discrete task replacement within structurally intact roles. The agentic research now being produced by the same institutions identifies workflow-level substitution as the operative mechanism, which produces a different exposure map, a different timeline, and a different set of roles in the highest risk category than the earlier model generated. The professionals most concentrated in structured workflow execution roles, the SARAs, are more exposed than the original forecasts suggested. For SARA, and for everyone whose role is built around structured workflow execution, the data is not asking for panic. It is asking for honest answers to two questions, and then for decisions made on that basis rather than on the assumption the earlier model was built on. The professionals concentrated in ambiguous, high-stakes judgment roles are more resilient. On economic output, McKinsey's 2023 generative AI value estimate of $2.60 to $4.40 trillion annually was built on 63 enterprise use cases across the generative AI landscape broadly. Agentic AI is the deployment architecture increasingly being used to realize that value, not through incremental productivity improvement but through structural labor substitution at the workflow level, generating nonlinear returns. The gain is real, but it coexists on the same pages of the same research, with the IMF's finding that these systems accelerate the capital versus labor income split because they generate returns as capital assets without proportional labor input. The productivity gain and the displacement event are the same event. On systemic risk, the enterprise risk frameworks, insurance models, and liability structures built around reactive AI failure modes do not address cascade failure dynamics in autonomous systems. Stanford HAI and DeepMind's alignment research have documented the mechanism. The institutions building agentic systems know the failure mode exists. The regulatory and risk infrastructure built to contain it does not yet exist in any major economy. On governance, the EU AI Act, the most advanced binding regulation in existence, is structurally mismatched to agentic systems by its own design assumptions. The OECD, the UK AI Safety Institute, and the EU AI Office have each published research in 2024 acknowledging this gap in their own frameworks. The institutions tasked with governing agentic AI are not currently equipped to govern it. That is the actual state of agentic AI in 2025. Not the state the headlines are describing. The state the institutions are describing in their own research, including the parts of their research where they are correcting their own earlier conclusions. And here is what that means for you specifically. Whether you are a professional asking whether your role looks like Sarah's. Whether you are an investor trying to price agentic AI risk and opportunity against forecasts that were built on the wrong model. Whether you are a policy professional working on governance frameworks for systems the most advanced regulatory architecture in the world has publicly acknowledged it cannot yet govern. Or whether you are simply someone who wants to understand what is actually happening rather than what the headlines say is happening. The public narrative on agentic AI has not yet priced in what the institutional research is now saying. The forecasts are being revised. The risk frameworks are being rebuilt. The governance architectures are being reconceptualized. All of that is happening now while deployment is already running. Understanding that gap between where the public narrative sits and where the institutional research actually is not a guarantee of getting the next decade right. No framework is. But it is the difference between navigating what is actually being built and preparing for something the institutions responsible for analyzing it have already superseded. That is the real state of agentic AI, according to the data we actually have. If that kind of analysis is what you have been looking for, no hype, no founder quotes dressed up as evidence, just the hardest institutional data on the most consequential technology shift currently underway, then day after tomorrow is where that analysis lives. Every video on this channel goes to the primary research, the full reports, the places where the institutions agree and the places where they don't. The numbers that complicate the narrative rather than confirm it. Because the day after tomorrow is already being built. And the people who understand what is actually being built are the ones with the framework to respond to it. Subscribe to Day After Tomorrow. We'll see you in the next one.